All right, well, welcome everybody, and we're glad to see you here. My name is James Bender, and I own and operate Waypoint Survival. So I was asked to come here and give a speech on 18th century survival skills, and I will also be later on in our later sessions talking about how those skills translate and how we can use those ideas, putting them in a 21st century context. Once we have our gear and we understand the mindset of an 18th century survivor, then we can put all of these things in together and kind of make a conclusion of how we want to gear up ourselves for modern day survival, whether you want to go full-blown 18th century or if you just want to do a more traditional camp out, kind of an idea where you integrate some of these items into your own personal outdoor adventures. All right, so 18th century survival skills. As most of you know, I've been doing a video series and filming right here, of course, at the fort, and I do appreciate the opportunity to do that. It's been a great help. And so that should come out in very shortly as episode 12. I don't have a title yet for it, but we'll be working on that. Will be episode 12. Anyhow, getting ready for this process of filming this series, I began to do intensive research and collecting gear based on what would be commonly found on the frontier during that period of time. And of course, for anybody that wants to get involved in this hobby, it is a little bit expensive. But there's a good side, there's an upside to the expense. Most of the items are handmade, and they are heavy duty and very durable. So when you purchase quality items, you can expect to have a lot of them for the rest of your life. So it's well worth it to buy quality items from local craftsmen, people made here in America, from people who understand what the 18th century was about and who understand how to make that gear, and much of it is even made in the very same way that it was being made well over 200 years ago. So all of that stuff's really important when you begin to put it together and you're thinking about what it might actually be like to take a long distance trek or to go out into a survival type world. 18th century survival. So, survival only happens for a couple of reasons. Either you've done something very foolish, or something has gone terribly, drastically, tragically wrong. And we think of the Donner Party and other stories such as the soccer team that crashed in South America. And what a terrible disaster that was for all of those people who ended up suffering and experiencing the pain and heartache of watching their friends and the Donner Party, even their loved ones and their family, die. So survival happens, as I said, because either you've done something very foolish or you've done something that didn't work out right and it went terribly, sometimes tragically wrong. The interesting thing about the 18th century and centuries before and after is that they understood a lot more about their world than most of us are in tune with today. So how does that figure into it? Well, they were people of their time. When we talk about survival skills, we talk about people who understand survival. We have survival skills in our 21st century time frame. Being able to operate a cell phone, understanding how to pump gas into a car, or if you have an electric or a hybrid, how to plug it in, where the charging stations are. So if you brought someone from the 18th century to our world, they would have a tough time surviving. Many of the people would have absolutely no idea how to operate a basic microwave. I mean, we do not think of these as survival skills. We honestly look at them as the opposite of survival skills. This is the modern world that has made us weak. But the truth of it is, you know how to navigate a 21st century world and live in it because you do it every day. So, I said all that to say this. When we put things back into an 18th century context, we then remember that those people also knew and understood common basic things like how to hitch up a horse to a wagon. I mean, how many people in the modern world, the modern context, have spent very much time? You may have seen it done at a reenactment. Maybe you've messed around a little bit at a farm or a barn, and maybe some of you grew up that way. But most people in the modern world, if you handed them all of the traces and the reins and the bit and all of the things that goes onto a horse to properly harness it, if you had all the parts there, including the cart, most people would not be able to hitch up the horse because they have no idea how to do it. But 8, 9, 10-year-old kids did it every day in the 18th century. Great big horses with the family wagon or the carriage. It was part of their job, part of growing up and being part of their world. So, again, I'm trying to put this stuff in context. What seems interesting and strange to us was a common, normal, everyday life. For instance, we are so used to turning on a thermostat and heat comes out of the register in the wintertime. We're also used to turning that thermostat the other way and cool air. Floods are wonderfully modern insulated homes and provides us a cooling atmosphere during the heat of the summer. Of course, that has made us weaker to the point where people can no longer even endure the heat of the summer. I can get back in the house. Right? Because we've become so accustomed, we're really in some ways very pampered. They did not have that. If you wanted to cool off, you would go into the woods. You'd get under the trees, under the canopy. It's 10 to 15 degrees cooler into the shade of the forest. They would also have the creeks and the streams and the ponds. They would go swimming. They would go in at the end of the workday, not only to bathe and wash off, but also to cool themselves down. So they understood basic survival skills, but they didn't have the stuff we have. So as a result, every child grew up learning how to make fire. They knew how to carry fire. A very common thing on the 18th century frontier was to have a pan with a lid and a handle, and that was to run to the neighbor's house for some coals. If your fire went out, remember, they didn't have matches, they didn't have Bic lighters, they didn't have all the things that we consider click and there's a flame, right? You didn't have any click and there's a flame. You had to use flint and steel. You had to use charred materials. There was a laborious process to getting a fire started. Whereas if you could just go down, 4 or 5 miles down the road to the neighbor's cabin, your fire had gone out overnight, but you send one of the kids with that firebox to carry coals, and they would run down to the neighbors. They would scoop up a decent pile of hot coals, put it in that metal pan, close the lid, you grab the handle to extend it out so you didn't burn yourself, and then you would run back to your cabin and dump it into the fireplace and pile your wood on, and in a very short order, you yourself would also have a blazing fire. Those are things that we don't think of anymore. You might go to your neighbor to borrow a cup of sugar or a stick of butter, right? But we don't think anymore of how do I carry fire? A very common 18th century survival skill. As a matter of fact, the Native Americans, they had developed methods of binding together various grasses and vines and bark into a tube, which was tied. It looked like a great big giant cigar-shaped thing. And that was how they carried fire. They would put a coal inside of that, and because they didn't, remember, up until the advent of white settlers, they didn't have metal things. They didn't have pots and pans, and they didn't have something to carry fire, so they would make this out of natural materials. They would put a coal in the center, and they would carry it. And they might make 2 or 3 or 4 of these and have it on them depending on how long their journey was. And as they traveled, they would hold that so that the wind would blow onto that coal, would continue to keep it, would smolder down. They might stop and blow on it every once in a while to keep that coal burning. And then when it burned down to where it wasn't enough to hang on to, they would either stop and make another one, or if they'd already made an extra, they would dump the coal into that one, and then they would continue on their journey. That way, when they got where they were going, if the wind was actually a help, the breeze, because it's blowing a coal, it's not a flame, so you're not worried about it going out. You want to keep it fanned. And so when they would get where they were going, then they would arrange their fire lay, and they would dump the coal in there, blow it into flame, and they didn't have to work hard at friction fire, or later on even with flint and steel. Again, they were people of their age, and they understood how to do that. They would walk out into the woods around here, and they would recognize the materials that they would need to make such a fire match or a fire carrying apparatus. So it's really amazing when you put all of this together of how they were people indeed of their time, and they understood how to live in that time, just as you understand how to live in yours. So they didn't want to get into a survival situation any more than we do. It happened a lot more often, especially on the frontier, because of a lack of companionship. So someone alone would have it much harder than someone with a companion. They also had issues with resupply. Trading posts were few and far between on the frontier, and there was no guarantee when you got there that they would have, for instance, the powder and lead, or the flints that you were looking for. English flints, German flints. Of course, there was plenty of flint in the United States, but then it would require you to have some minimal napping skills. And you would have to stop, and you'd have to search, you'd have to find something. It was much easier to have pre-made flints. Yeah, so when you think about all of this, and then you show up at the trading post and they're out of powder and they're out of lead and there are no flints, and you were hoping to resupply. That's one reason why Daniel Boone at Fort Boonesborough started manufacturing gunpowder, because it was really hard to get on the frontier. So when we think of all of the things that play into an 18th century survival skill set, again, we have to get into the mind, the habits, the lifestyle of how these people lived. And so I have a basic gear list, and these are many of the items that I had used, not the buffalo coat. I used that last night, it was cold. But most of the items here I have carried in my haversack, not the backpack. I brought that along just to show what an 18th century pack, a pack that could have been made similar to what Otzi made 5,000 years ago. It's a deer hide with wood and sinew, and with a tump line and shoulder straps. But this is something that you would very possibly have seen for thousands of years in a pack style. All it is a bag strapped to a wooden frame made from a flexible sapling with cross pieces, mortised and tenon in. And you're welcome to come up and look at that when the class is over. So, you would have all of these items that you would carry with you. Now, some people would have more, some people would have less. When Davy Crockett left to go to the Alamo, he had his rifle, he had his shot pouch and his powder horn, his knife, and his blanket roll. And he was considered a wealthy man for his day and very well equipped. And he went all the way from Tennessee to Texas. And that's what he had. They had a different outlook on life than we do. We live very luxurious lives. Like I said, a person might not necessarily carry everything that I have. The reason that I'm carrying so much in the film series is because when you consider the fact that you may not be able to resupply for 100 miles, and you're going through enemy territory, and you don't ever know what tomorrow holds. There are no GPS systems. There is no news forecast. You have no idea what the weather's going to do from day to day. You do your best by wind and weather and animal patterns, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, to kind of guess what the next day is going to be like. But you could be caught out at any moment. So you have to be super cautious, and you are on your own, thoroughly, completely on your own. And so for your gear list, you would have a rifle, a powder horn, shot pouch, of course, which would contain lead and flint, patching or patching material. You would also have some sort of grease. I have a very, very small tin of grease. Again, you didn't put a lot of grease on your rifle. But you carry a small tin of some sort of lard or other type of grease like you use for axles. And you open that up, and then you would use that to grease the important parts of your rifle. Now, you didn't want it over-greased, so most of what you would grease would be the internal workings of the lock, and of course keep rust down. And then often they would also rub, it would melt beeswax and mix that with turpentine and things to make it more of a fluid mixture, and the whole entire gun would be rubbed down with that mixture to help prevent rust out on the trail. And you would periodically take care of that. So you would also carry, with all of your items, you would carry some tow, and I have a little leather bag there of flax tow, and that is used for cleaning the rifle. It can also be used as a fire starting tinder. So flax tow is very important. A grease rag, which is laying there on top of the shot pouch. And grease rag is very important because, again, you have to wipe your rifle down, especially if you've been out into a rain, especially if you've just been around muddy conditions. It has to be cleaned off. It is very possibly the one item that can save your life. Because remember, the flintlock rifle is not only for firing and shooting at animals and protecting yourself from enemies, but it's also a sparking device that can be used to start a fire. So it's very, very important that it stays in complete working order, and that every time you pull the trigger, it goes bang. So you have to be able to disassemble it on the trail, thoroughly clean it, and wipe it back down with grease and wax and things to make sure that it continues to function for you. Guns were very, very expensive, and it would take perhaps an entire year's salary to purchase, especially a rifle. That's a 50 caliber rifle, and the difference between a rifle, of course, and a smoothbore is that a rifle has rifling, hence the name rifle, which spins the shot, the lead ball, as it comes out. And a smoothbore is what we would think like a modern shotgun. It's just a hollow tube, it's smooth all the way through. There are no grooves or riflings. So rifles are more accurate because of the spinning the shot. It's one thing that helped us win the Revolutionary War, were our long-range rifles. And so, whereas most of the brown bests, the muskets, and things like that, they were smoothbore. And by the way, some of them were very large, all the way up to 75 caliber. That's a 3/4 inch lead ball. 50 caliber is a 1/2 inch lead ball. So pretty decent sized shot. And the larger the rifle, the heavier the lead that you had to carry, because it takes more lead. It takes twice as much lead for a 50 caliber as it does for a 25 caliber. So that's why you will often see, after most of the big game was killed out in the United States, a lot of the eastern buffalo, a lot of the bears, as you get into the late 18th and then early 19th centuries, you find that the 40 caliber and 36 caliber, something we would know perhaps as a squirrel gun, became much more popular. The report wasn't as loud, it took less lead, it took less powder. Okay, you see what I'm saying? Because that's money. Every time you pull the trigger, it goes bang. That's something that you had to either make yourself or you had to purchase from somewhere. So a very, very important item to be able to use and to maintain. Because again, it's not just something that you can play around with. It has to work and function, and you can't ignore it, or you might die. So if you could only grab one item, it would be your rifle, and of course, along with the rifle, the powder horn and the shot pouch, they are indispensable. Like they're part of a unit. So you would never just walk out with just the rifle. You would also always grab the shot pouch and the powder horn, because that had the stuff that you needed to feed it, as it were, and to keep it functioning. All right, so as we think about all of these things that are going on in the mind of an 18th century person who is thinking about, I might get into a survival situation. If my rifle and my shot pouch and my powder horn are my most expensive and most important items, you will do a couple of things. You will either keep them very close to hand, or, as you'll see me do in my episodes, and as many of the frontiersmen did, they actually slept with the rifle. When you crawled into your blanket, it was right beside you. You were actually holding on to your rifle. Many frontiersmen even slept with their shot pouch and powder horn on their side. And they didn't always necessarily lay down. For instance, if you could find a hollow tree that was big enough to sit in, you might just sleep in a sitting position. Now, there's a reason why they did that as well. If you look into some of the early cabins, some of the reproductions, you'll see that they have a lot of pillows and things stuffed on the bed. The reason for that is that the cabins of the day were very smoky. People actually had a significant amount of lung damage from breathing smoke from the time they were little all the way up in their smoky cabins. And so they had to sit and sleep like that in order to just breathe. It's an interesting thing that we don't think about, but their lifestyle wasn't always the healthiest, even though they had a lot of non-GMO food. So it wasn't uncommon to lean up against a tree and fall asleep in a sitting position, because it was something they were used to doing. They did it at home. They did it in the cabins. They would sleep propped up, which again lends itself to getting into a hollow tree that's big enough to sit in. You can just lean back. You got your rifle by your side. Your shot powder horn is still on you. Pull your blanket over top, and you go to sleep. And it's not necessarily uncomfortable, because you're used to doing it. Your body is like us as we get older in America, where we get stiff. We're not used to bending down. Our knees start to lock up, and the back, and we have all of these problems. But they weren't used to that kind of stuff, because they actually lived that life. And it's just as you go to third world countries or undeveloped countries, which is a more popular term now, and you'll find that their toilets, it's just a hole in the floor, and you're expected to squat over top. And you'll see people in their 70s and 80s sitting on their haunches around campfires, doing tasks, working around the house. It's their seat. Wherever they go, they squat, because they're so used to it, they do it their whole life. We don't do that. Everything we have is elevated. So as a result, as we get older, we get to where we can't squat anymore. Just an interesting thing. Again, back in the 18th century, they were people of their era, and they understood how to do these things. So you would also have a tomahawk or a belt axe, and you might, if you were headed to a cabin, you might also be carrying a felling axe, which I have there as well. A heavy wool blanket, a bedroll. Most of the wool blankets that we get today, the weave is not very tight. Now, what I'm carrying is a piece of canvas, and my wool blanket down there, it's that red canvas roll down there. And they didn't necessarily bring canvas. They would have a bedroll. Inside that bedroll, they would have possibly some extra items. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. But they didn't have a lot. They might have an extra shirt, maybe an extra pair of socks, maybe some gloves, a hat for sleeping at night or for colder weather. But that was about it. Again, these were not wealthy people. They not to the like we think, where we have a closet full of clothes. And so they had what they had, and everything you carried was more weight. So they would have that heavy wool blanket, and it was a dense weave, so that a person could wrap it about themselves, and they might indeed be able, believe it or not, to fend off the rain with just the wool blanket. Simon Kenton often said, he talked about waking up where snow had fallen on him during the night as he was sitting out in enemy territory, wool blanket around him, and he didn't even know it had snowed. Their wool blankets were made much better. If you can get, Whitney still makes wool blankets similar to what they had back in those days, and especially if you find a vintage Whitney, W-I-T-N-E-Y, Whitney blanket. You can still get them on eBay and places like that. They would also have a possibles kit. And of course, we're talking about survival. And in that possibles kit would be the things that they might possibly need. These were the possibles. So it would be your extra things, the stuff that we would consider. You might carry a pair of reading glasses, depending on your eye strength. Maybe you needed it for working on your rifle or for writing a letter home. Especially your far vision might be okay, but you might have some other issues where you couldn't see up close very well. So you would want to have some reading glasses. And remember, Benjamin Franklin and all these, he invented bifocals. I mean, glasses have been around since like the 1500s. So it wasn't an uncommon thing for people to have glasses. You would also carry perhaps extra flints. You would have things in your possibles kit, like maybe an extra flint and steel. Because again, fire, very, very important. And they want to make sure that they had all of that. You would also have a haversack. And the haversack would be your other camp items. In my haversack, I've got my copper boiler, my corn boiler right there, cooking oil, my journal goes in there, things for my lead pencil, 18th century brass lead pencil for writing home, and all of the other items that go in there, my cow's knee, which is the lock cover that goes over top of the lock in inclement weather to make sure that you don't get rain into the powder in the pan. That's in there. So all of the stuff that you might need would be located in that area. Haversack is very important. You may or may not have a canvas cover. Obviously a cup and a boiling pot would be very important. They boiled a lot of things back then, and it was very common to carry things, the roots of course, and items you would find along the way. The interesting thing about boiling food, as opposed to cooking it, see, when you cook a squirrel over fire and it's sizzling and dripping grease, you're losing nutrition. Whereas if you cut it up and you put it into a pot and you boil it, if you boil it long enough, the bones will even get soft enough for you to eat. I don't know if you've ever left a chicken in a slow cooker overnight, but the bones will get so soft that you can just chew them and eat them very easily. You can actually eat the entire chicken that way, if you wish, minus like the claws and the head. But you could literally get a lot more nutrition out of it by continuing to boil it. So if you boil a squirrel, you get all of the nutrition, and then of course you drink the broth. And it was a way to maximize everything that came out of that, the marrow. Because remember, one shot, where did it come from? 2 shots, it came from over there. So you had to be super careful to make every shot count. Number one, every time you pull the trigger, it goes bang. There's powder and lead going down range. There's another scar or a chip off of your flint that is wearing down. You might get 10 to 15 shots out of a flint before you have to switch sides. So there's 2 sides to a flint, and then you have to re-nap that edge or it stops sparking. So you need to carry a small napping tool as well. As you think of all of the items that went, they understood this stuff. We're hearing about it today, and we learned about it. Wow, I don't do that one. I go camping. But they did because it was normal. It was common stuff. It would be like me talking about a smartphone, but like you have to swipe up to change, or side to side to change photos. Like, I know that. They didn't, because it's part of our life. So they had an understanding of things. A canteen, you may or may not have one, but remember it was a long distance between places, and so you want to make sure that you had water, and not all water was good. You'd have your hussif with you. Anybody know what a hussif is? It's a transliteration of the word housewife. And it's a sewing kit. Sailors had them, frontiersmen had them, and your basic needle, thread, thimble, a small pair of scissors. Of course, you could always use your knife, but a small pair of scissors would always be very useful, safer. Remember, when you're out in the frontier, surviving in a survival situation, you want to make sure that you don't hurt yourself. So whipping out your big belt knife to cut a thread, again, you'd have to be careful. So a small pair of scissors, if you could afford it, if it was available to you. Scissors have been around for thousands of years, so they would have definitely had things like that. Again, things that you would have to carry. Also a belt knife, of course, you definitely want to have that, and a sharpening stone. I find it amazing. We talk about survival and bushcraft and all of this stuff, and I'm amazed at how many people will go out into the wilderness with a knife or an axe and no way to sharpen it. Of course, I mean, they plan on being out 2 or 3 days. It's not a big deal. They're going to come back and be fun. But people build these bug out bags, they have all this stuff. Do you have a sharpening stone? How are you going to maintain the edge, especially if you have modern steels? Now, the steels from years ago were mostly high carbon steels, and so you could sometimes find a rock out in a creek that would sharpen that knife or axe for you. But again, not as good as a proper, what we would call an Arkansas stone of some sort, right? So you want to make sure to have a proper sharpening stone. Or even a small file. They had files in the 18th century. They might be a little expensive, but again, if you're going out to build a cabin and your main tool is an axe, you might indeed go to the blacksmith at the same time and have him make you a file that was properly sized to maintain the edge on your axe. Just something you might want to do. In your Possibles Kit contents, we talked about this a little bit. Flint and steel, some tinder, reading glasses, a burning glass. Burning glass we know is magnifying lens, right? A burning glass, because again, it's a 100%, as long as the sun's shining, you're not going to wear it out, because you have to wrap it in cloth or paper to make sure that or parchment to make sure that it doesn't get scratched. But the ease that a person could carry that and make fire that didn't require you striking something together or using up a valuable resource, that's a pretty good deal. So absolutely, and they're not that big and they're not that heavy, and so you want to carry that in your Possibles kit. You would want to probably carry a blanket pin. Again, when you put your blanket over your top of your head as a hood, you pull it around the top, you tie it around the waist either with your belt or with a piece of string or rope, or you can get a proper blanket pin that dates back to Roman times, and you put that on there and you twist it and turn it. It's got a pin. I've got one I can show you when we are done with this if you want to see it, and it holds your blanket together properly. Very valuable, something that will, and it doesn't tear up your blanket. So something important to have. You might carry a comb for your hair, lice, nits. Remember, people had body lice, they had hair lice back then. And so you might indeed, as part of your normal life, Louis Wetzel from Ohio, he had long black hair. They called him Deathwind, and he grew his hair long to taunt the Native Americans. But he regularly combed out his long hair. How did he do that? You think he used his fingers? No, he probably had what we would call a comb, but it was a horn comb made from cow horn. Cash money. If a person had any cash money, they would obviously be carrying that with them for those occasions when they went to the trading post. Honestly, most people, like now, they were part of a cashless society. They bartered and traded. You would go out and trap beaver or shoot a deer, and you would skin the hide off and tan it, and it was worth $1. Hence the word a buck. Right? So each skin would be worth, a tan hide would be worth $1 on the frontier. So we would call it a buckskin. Pocket knife. There were various types of pocket knives. And remember that the frontiersmen, they were not stupid people. They weren't like some of us who, if you could only take one knife into a survival situation, what's the perfect knife? The perfect knife is the one you have on you. And so they had multiple knives. They would have skinning knives, they would have a hunting knife, they would have a pocket knife. They might carry a smaller, thinner knife. Most of the frontier knives that we look at today looked a lot like kitchen knives. They were thin-bladed, fairly long. They were not what we call survival knives today, which look like sharpened pry bars. They were big, thick steel, and you can hammer it into a tree and use it as a step if you need to. These were thin, fairly easily maintained. And a lot of them, you can see from the period, were very worn down from multiple sharpenings. Of course, needle and thread, a very important thing for your Possibles kit. What about food? What would you carry into an 18th century survival situation for food? Well, they had limited options. They didn't have freeze-dried food, and they couldn't just stop off at the local McDonald's, right? If you didn't hunt or have a successful hunt, most of them hunted, but even back then, they would come back empty-handed. Game, they're not just waiting around for you to show up, right? And so they would carry parched corn. Was a very, very important item. And something very similar that we can get today are the corn nuts. So if you want to try parched corn, go to a Kroger or a local store and get you a little plastic container of corn nuts. And that would be similar to what they had. And it wasn't sweet corn. It was more what we would call field corn. And they would put it in a pan with some oil, and they would kind of roast it, is how they would do it. And then they would carry that. Maybe they would grind it into a powder, make a little bit of a meal. And they would often, they were so concerned, and corn was so important. We can't understand how important corn was on the frontier, but it was considered a staple food. It was the thing that you had to have to survive. And so they would have a small bag that might hold, maybe 4, 5, 6 cups of corn. And they would have a cord around their waist, and they would wear it on the small of their back. And it went with them everywhere. Like that was the thing that you had, because that was your survival food, was that parched corn. And so they might also have jerk of some sort, whether it be beef or buffalo or deer. We call it jerky, but they just refer to it as jerk. It could be any type of jerk. And the term venison, while we think of venison as referring to deer, in 18th century, venison could be any wild animal. So it could be possum venison, right? But whatever you could get could be referred to as venison. Just like, every thing you blow your nose on isn't actually a Kleenex, because Kleenex is a brand. But we say, hand me a Kleenex, although what we really need is a facial tissue. That's the generic name for it, right? So they just kind of, go out and get some venison. They might also, depending on their religious beliefs, they might also have salt pork along with them, which was a big staple on the frontier. Dried peas or dried beans, those were also very commonly used. And they would perhaps also have salt and a kitchen pepper mix. And I carry both salt and a kitchen pepper mix with me in my haversack. And of course that is very important. Salt, you will die without having proper salt, and so there were only specific salt licks. Now if you lived around the ocean, it wasn't a big deal. Very easy to boil salt water down and get salt. But when you get to the interior of the United States, you would look for salt licks, and you would look for places where you could go and either boil it down, or sometimes if it was salty enough, you could actually pry up crusty bits of salt from around the edge of the pool where it had dried, and you could load up on that. There's places out, you go to the panhandle of Oklahoma. There's massive salt flats. Back in the early days, in the pioneer times, they actually scooped that salt up and processed it and sent it back east. It was a really big deal to have salt. And of course, we know that salt makes a lot of things taste better. So it's very important to have those spices. As a matter of fact, how important salt was, if you go back to Roman times, you will find out that people would trade, and they would get paid at times. They would weigh salt as important as gold. And the Roman soldiers, when they got their pay, when they went to the paymaster, they would actually weigh to them so much salt, and they would take the salt and go to the market to buy their food and other items they needed, and they had the balance beam scales, and you would weigh out your salt into that until it weighed so much, and that's how you would pay for your food. It was actually used as money. And that's where we get the term that a person is worth their salt. Okay? So it's a very important thing that salt was super important, and they carried it. Medical. What did they have for medical? Well, they had knowledge of herbs. They would sometimes carry dried herbs, like now. Everything's dead, it's wintertime, so they would make sure previous to the year, during the spring and the summer and the fall, when things were blooming and in season, especially if a person was on a long-term journey, they would gather the herbs and a small quantity and carry them with them. They perhaps would even have a small bottle of bitters. You can still get bitters today, the herbs that will help you if you get sick. They would also have some bandaging material, some sort of linen or muslin. Remember, cotton was very expensive. Just the opposite of today. Today, the cheapest clothes we get are cotton clothes. But back then, cotton was very expensive. And so it was just the opposite. They would have linen and things like that, or homespun that was made from flax and things, and linen that they would grow. The fears, their medical fears for the day were to get hit with dysentery, which of course is, you get explosive diarrhea from drinking bad water or getting poisoned. They didn't understand germs. They didn't understand the things that we face today. When we look at microscopes and we see all these little tiny organisms that can make us ill, they didn't understand that. They knew about humors, vapors, and there was a lot of things that they talked about that today it sounds like the Dark Ages. But again, you got to remember, medical science was in its infancy. That's how George Washington died. They bled him to death because they thought he had bad blood. And so when your blood is bad and you're sick, you got to let out some of it. And of course, we know this if you've ever donated blood, that when you give that bag or two of blood, that you feel sort of lethargic, but man, the next day you feel great. Because your body has manufactured all that new blood to replace what you've lost, and you get like a surge of energy. It actually makes you feel healthful the next day. Well, they knew that, and so they erroneously assumed that your blood is bad. That's why you feel bad. So if we can bleed you out, then you will start to get better because you'll feel better. Right? Of course, we understand now that's not exactly why that happens. But they feared dysentery. They also feared something that they called ague. Sometimes pronounced ague, but A-G-U-E. Also referred to as chilblains, but that's fever and chills. And it would absolutely incapacitate a person. Imagine you're on the frontier. You're by yourself, or there's a group of 2 or 3 of you, and it's highly contagious and hits all of you, and you're laid up in camp. You're shivering, you can't hunt, you're weak, and you've got the fever and the chills, and you're just completely incapacitated. And about that time, a local tribe decides to come pay you a visit. Very bad stuff. They feared fever and chills. They also feared wounds, because a wound not properly cared for could turn into gangrene. And they would often, like I said, they didn't understand antibiotics. They did understand chewing certain roots or herbs and placing them in wounds. Of course, then you get the person, whoever chewed it, you get their mouth bacteria in the wound. So again, they didn't understand what we know today. They also understood poultices, and they would make various types of poultices to cover that, to bind it up. But sometimes, and I know this sounds terrible, but there's reports of guys who would take, if they had a really bad wound, they would take and heat up a knife or a bayonet in the fire, and they would just literally cauterize the wound to burn out the infection. For instance, if you had an artery that was bleeding really bad, an arterial bleed, you're going to be dead in 10 minutes. You've got to get this thing sealed up. And it was not commonly used, but once in a while in a drastic situation, they would pour black powder onto the wound and light it. And it would instantly cauterize the wound and seal off the artery. It was that or death. Very, very painful, extremely hot. Imagine having burning black powder placed, number one, into a wound, the sulfur and all that. I mean, it's going to hurt like crazy to have that happen, and then have someone touch it off and light it. Incredible pain, but it's that or die. Okay, so they suffered through these things, but they had some fears. Again, like I said, dysentery, ague, and wounds.